Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Welcome once more to me, Phil Craig, and the Scandal Mongers podcast. And no, not the Australian bar. Oh no, no Australian bar, no Skippy. Just here, lovely Madeira. Can you see that out of my window? That's the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Morocco. Beautiful island of Madeira. I'll just unplug myself so you can see better. Hang on, here we go. Here we go, all around there. Let's see, that is Funchal, famous Reed's Hotel, church I used to stay in. We can't afford that one, but we like the one that we're in. Hang on, put this down, put myself back in. Oh, it's all very low tech. Got my holiday t-shirt on, got my sunglasses. Oh, honestly, I'm on holiday with Mrs. Craig and her mum, Jennifer. And if you follow me on Twitter, it is like being on holiday with a couple of teenage girls. It is actually quite embarrassing. Cocktails, giggly stories. We went to look at these gardens and there were these hedges and they may have looked like a penis. Can I say penis? Oh dear. Well, it's after lunch. I've just said it. And they were giggling like anything. And I'm like, actually, I'm the youngest in the group, so be respectable, please. And no, it's like, look at that thing. It looks like a funny thing. And look at that. It's like a man's thingy. And Ulo, let's have some cake. Yes. Hang on a minute. Francis, I'm just telling the world the truth about you. It's true, isn't it? She said it's absolutely true. She's ashamed of herself. But yeah, here we are having a wonderful time on our holidays. And yeah, it's been quite a week, actually. I'm going to have to take this off because I can't see a bloody thing. Let's see. I have some notes. Come on, Phil, be professional. There's only one glass of wine at lunch. Hang on, here we go. Oh, yes, that's much better. Take those off. Put these on. Yeah, oh, goodness, Prince Andrew. Andrew Loney has been all over social media today, and this is such a big story. And he has promised to come back onto the pod to talk about it when his book's ready. But there's so much coming out now. I mean, I hope Andrew isn't a bit disappointed that somebody's stealing his thunder, because this revelation, if you haven't seen it, I'll tell you the brief outline, that it looks like Andrew was friends with somebody who was basically a spy for the Chinese government. And as Andrew Loney has always said, he's a security risk, the way he went about representing Britain on these trade missions, but also, it would seem, representing himself and Fergie and trying to mix up his own private business affairs with whatever he was doing for various British companies. He was always very dodgy. And because he's a man who needed money, he's quite exploitable, and it looks like he's been exploited. And I don't know how this will play out in terms of his living arrangements and his future role, if he's ever going to have any in the royal family, but it's just another twist in an incredibly extraordinary story that just gets more and more embarrassing, I think, for the royal family, and more damning, I think, also of the system that we have here, where, you use people like that on these important diplomatic missions. And maybe occasionally it works, if some deals come in because of him, I wouldn't gainsay it. But it just looks like he's kind of lining his own pockets, or if not his own pockets, his friends' pockets, and it's deeply dodgy and a bit embarrassing for the country. Certainly for his brother, King Charles, I'm sure, very embarrassed. What else is new? Oh yes, the mystery solved. If you've been following the preambles to our here I am again, rushing ahead. There is some content coming up, I promise you. Carolyn Harris, a new friend, is going to tell the most amazing story of royal scandal you've ever heard. I promise you, you're going to love it. But before we get to Carolyn, a few things that have been rumbling. The possum. Yes, the scandal of the possums. A few weeks ago, we heard that Susan Marg, one of our Australian listeners, had fallen asleep having had too many White Russians, an incident with her possums. And various of you said, well, possums can mean children in Australia. We all remember Dame Edna, Ella Possum. Yeah, it is a term of endearment out there, but no, she's written to us and she said, no, these are real possums. And there's quite a family saga, a soap opera. It's hard to follow, but there's been various incidents of what she calls domestic violence breaking out between the various possums in her life. But she said, after giving me the nice update on the possums, she said, this has been going on for 54 weeks and there are regular gang incidents. Anyway, I'm having Bloody Marys tonight, and I loved your show, Phil, and I love your preambles. Well, I hope you love this one too. So, yeah, you can learn all about natural world and history, like David Attenborough, really. What else? Oh, JM162. I read some of her comments, but I said it was a man. I don't know why I thought she was Jim, but she's not. Phil, do not misgender me, she said, with 4 laughing emojis. So hopefully I haven't offended her. Another lovely review. I get some Apple reviews now and again, not as many as YouTube. Got a nice Apple review from, here's a mouthful, Lemgemeister. Lemgemeister from America? Maybe that's just a shortening of somebody's Christian name. Lemgemeister. Anyway, always an interesting and engaging podcast, by turns thought-provoking, funny, and fun. Sometimes enraging and sometimes amusing. Isn't that nice? What a terrific and informative listen. Do keep up the good work, Phil. But anyway, because we show all sides of all stories here, I also have to report Reginald Grunt-Futtock, Apple, he's not happy. Phil, your hectoring, sneering monologues, especially the one at the start of the Rory Shefflin-Jones episode, are the final straw. I'm taking a break. I'm so sorry if I hector or sneer. It's not my intention, but of course, not everybody likes everything. And there you go. I'll tell you somebody who does like it, though. Marion Douglas from California. She's Danger Kitty Films, and she was the happy winner of the mug, which is currently heading your way, Marion, all the way to California. It might be a bit slow because Christmas post and all that, but hopefully you'll get that soon and enjoy it and show it off. You'll be the envy of all your friends in whatever part of California you're living in. Carolyn. I contacted Caroline because she's written some amazing books on the subject of royal consorts. And I went into this interview with a list of about 6 of big stories that she's covered. Consorts, as you know, they're the people that marry into a royal family, usually the British royal family in these books. And more often than not, women, foreign princesses marrying into the royal family, so occasionally men, like famously Albert with Victoria. So I was going to talk to her about 6, but as you'll see, she was so entertaining and informative on just one story that I've had to book her to come back. And I hope you will agree when you hear this interview that that was the right decision. So anyway, I'm going to get back to my cocktails and Mrs. Craig. And one last look at the view. There we go. See why Churchill used to love to come here to paint. And here you go. Enjoy that and enjoy the interview. And I will see you at the end of this. Thanks for watching. Bye. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the Scandal Mongers and my Australian bar. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, I'm very keen to learn everything I need to know about the wonderful world of being a consort to a royal.
Yes, it's a very complicated role, as until relatively recently, a lot of royal consorts married in from other kingdoms, and they had this very delicate diplomatic role that they needed to fit in to this new monarchy, this new royal family that they'd married into, but they were also representing their kingdoms of origin. So that was a very delicate balance for a lot of these very young princesses and princes as well, who made these royal marriages, trying to become a successful queen consort, while at the same time you're acting in this diplomatic role. And that only changed relatively recently. King George V, after the First World War, granted permission for his children to marry into the British aristocracy. And now we see the definition of the ideal royal consort expands more and more as we expect royalty to be just like us in many ways. So we see how when Prince William married Catherine Middleton, that was the first time there had been a middle class bride for a direct heir to the throne since the future James II married Anne Hyde in 1660. So there has been a tremendous transformation in the definition of the ideal royal consort. When we look at the history, a lot of the scandals that emerge historically come from that tension between being a foreign princess in a new land. There might be cultural differences, diplomatic differences, religious differences after the Reformation, and that informed a lot of the ways in which these consorts were perceived.
Well, there seems to be a period where certain German states, and there were always lots and lots of little German states, their main export was marriageable young women.
Yes, and marriageable young men as well. The comments that were made about Saxe-Coburg Gotha being described as the stud farm of Europe at one time because of the number of Coburg princes, including Queen Victoria's husband,
Of course.
who were marrying out from there. There's trends in royal marriages over time. When we look at the Norman and early Plantagenet kings, there's a lot of consorts from what we would think of as France, Eleanor of Provence, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabelle of Angoulême. There are a lot of French influences. Then, when we look at the Wars of the Roses, we see some English born consorts, Elizabeth Woodville, for example. And then with the Tudors, four of Henry VIII, some six wives were women from within England. He only married two foreign princesses out of his six wives. And then with the Stuarts, we see a broad range: Denmark, France, Portugal, Modena in Italy. But the House of Hanover, being a German royal house themselves, although they were descended from James I in the female line, they tended to marry German princesses to the extent that when Queen Victoria's son, the future Edward VII, married Alexandra of Denmark, this was a very big deal, a marriage to a Danish princess. And so we see Tennyson composing poem, Sea King's daughter from over the sea, Alexandra, that Saxon and Norman and Dane are we, but all of us Danes at our welcome of thee, Alexandra. I don't know if that's Tennyson's best work, but it captures the enthusiasm that there was this Danish royal marriage taking place because there had been so many German royal marriages. This was seen as something different, and suddenly there were many British people who were very much rediscovering their Viking antecedents and getting quite interested in Scandinavian history.
Well, one of my favourites, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more in detail about her, is poor old Caroline of Brunswick.
Oh,
Who you
yes.
mentioned that they had this challenge to travel to an alien land to fit
Yes.
in with people. I believe in Caroline's case, she'd never even met her husband. And
No.
sometimes it didn't quite work out. The expectations didn't quite match. Tell us a little bit about
Yes.
her.
In Caroline of Brunswick's case, normally when these dynastic marriages took place, it's almost like being matched with a roommate in university. You try to find a way to live with this person and to find something that you respect or like rather than expecting a love match. So the expectations of royal marriages then were not the same as they are today. But Caroline of Brunswick, living in the late 18th century, she was living in an era when all of these new ideas about romance and companionate marriage were coming to the fore. We see sort of the birth of the novel around that time. So royalty were looking at their own circumstances, and certainly there are members of Caroline of Brunswick's family who noted that other people seemed to be able to marry according to their own inclination, that yes, there were limits. You married within your own social class, but their marriages weren't being arranged in the ways that were the case for 18th century royalty. So it was a difficult time for Caroline, that she was coming of age during a time when ideas of marriage were changing, but that was not the case if you were royalty. And so she's married to her first cousin, the future King George IV, the Prince Regent. And they met just before they were going to be married. And the first meeting went very, very badly.
Well, doesn't he already? He already has a secret illegal marriage
Yes.
and a couple of
George,
mistresses as well, of course.
Yes, George IV, his personal life was very messy. He had married Maria Fitzherbert, but she was Roman Catholic, and the Royal Marriages Act that had been proposed to Parliament by King George III decreed that male line descendants of King George II, in fact, descendants of King George II, provided they were not descendants of princesses who'd married foreigners, they couldn't marry without the sovereign's permission. And if you married a Roman Catholic, you were removed from the line of succession. So George IV had made a marriage to Maria Fitzherbert that if he'd been an ordinary person, it would have been a legal marriage, but it contravened the Royal Marriages Act. And so that marriage was illegal. So he was being pressured to make a dynastic marriage. He was promised some debts would be paid if he went ahead with this. And he was basically given the choice of two cousins, that either his father's niece or his mother's niece. And he chose his father's niece, and his mistress at the time, Lady Jersey, may have helped in the choice, choosing someone who wouldn't be a rival to her. So choosing the less attractive prospect. And they immediately took a dislike to each other. George IV meets Caroline of Brunswick, and even by 18th century standards, it seems her personal hygiene wasn't all that impressive. So he apparently turned to a valet and said, "Fetch me a brandy, I'm going to be ill." And meanwhile, Caroline looked at him, and he was much larger than the portrait she'd been sent. So there was an instant physical absence of attraction, but there was also a personality difference. The future George IV was very fastidious in terms of dress and manners and who he associated with. He was a great collector of French art and furniture and decorative culture, a great reader, that he was a big fan of Jane Austen's work and Sir Walter Scott's work, that he very much helped promote the novel when it was in its infancy in Britain. So the future George IV had a very high opinion of himself, his cultural attainments, whereas Caroline of Brunswick was somebody who could have a conversation with anyone. She didn't have that same desire to stand on ceremony. She could converse with people from all walks of life. And the public found this very endearing compared to her husband. She was seen as a people's princess in her time. And the future George IV couldn't understand why anyone found her engaging because he did not. And so he couldn't understand the pressure
Well, I'm
he
going
was
to
under.
interrupt you with a bit of my Wikipedia-based research. This is the depth you might expect on this podcast. But the two descriptions of their wedding night that they both separately wrote down.
Yeah.
Apparently, in a letter to one of his friends, he said he couldn't really bring himself to have sex with her, but he did. But he quotes, "It required no small effort on my part to conquer my aversion and overcome the disgust of her person." Which is not very gallant, is it? But later she said to one of her friends that he'd been so drunk during this event that he then passed the greatest part of the night, our bridal night, under the grate where he'd fallen and where I decided to leave him.
Yes, somehow their daughter, Princess Charlotte, was conceived, but it seems truly Georgian levels of brandy and ale were required in order for their marriage to
Yes,
be
that's right.
consummated.
Apparently they only really have a couple of nights together and
Yes.
miraculously they have a baby.
Yeah, they only had a couple of nights together, and then they conceive a child, and then they live separately, to the degree to which Princess Charlotte was amused when she was told that she was merely the heiress presumptive, and should there be a younger brother, she'd be superseded, that she knew her parents refused to be in the same room with one another, that there clearly would be no other children. And it's interesting. Says Charlotte grows up as the great hope of the monarchy. Her grandfather, King George III, was suffering from mental illness at that time. Her parents were at odds with one another. And once again, these ideas of companionate marriage and family life, and John Locke's ideas on education and that parents should take pleasure in their children. All of these new ideas of family life are developing, and the House of Hanover is out of step with this. They are at odds with one another. They're not really part of that culture. So Charlotte was viewed as the hope of the nation, and she comes of age and she was determined to make her own marriage. Her father preferred a Dutch prince, but she insisted on marrying the almost penniless Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Back to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha,
That's a
producing
good source for
handsome,
marriageable men and
eligible
women, as you
princes.
said.
And the wedding, it's one of the first very high profile royal weddings that in the past, in the House of Hanover, royal weddings had been court occasions. They had been celebrated at the court of the monarch, but they hadn't really been big public celebrations. There might be, free ale and food provided to crowds. There might be some kind of a parade as a foreign princess arrived. but the ceremony itself was relatively quiet. But we see with Charlotte's wedding, the groom is getting mobbed on his way to the wedding, and the public are
So
trying to
where are
unhitch.
Charlotte's parents in all this? I mean, does
Where are
Caroline
Charlotte's
come?
parents and all this? Separated from one another. They lived in separate houses within London. There's sort of, Carlton
Do they both
House,
come
and
to the
then
wedding of their only child?
do they come to the wedding of their only child? I believe the future George IV is present. Caroline later in life traveled abroad
Uh-huh.
extensively, and that would be an issue later in life. Caroline and Charlotte did have some rather frayed relations. Charlotte found both of her parents difficult to interact with. She commented at one point that my mother was bad, but she wouldn't have been so bad if my father had not been infinitely worse. So we see Charlotte's grandmother and her aunts, Queen Charlotte and her unmarried aunts, really took a strong impact and involvement in her upbringing because we see that the future George IV didn't like being reminded of the child who was the reminder of that drunken wedding night. And Charlotte herself, in her relations with Caroline, that Caroline certainly does seem to have been attached to her daughter and complained that she was only allowed these weekly visits, and that was very difficult for her. But gradually, Caroline spends more and more time abroad, and so not quite an estrangement, but it seems mother and daughter were not
No,
particularly
this
close
is
by the
such a
time.
classic soap opera because all sorts of things are happening. Charlotte, she doesn't thrive, does she? She dies in childbirth, is that right?
Yes, and it's very sad because, as I say, Leopold and Charlotte were the hope of the monarchy. The crowd had unhitched the horses of his carriage and tried to pull it themselves to the wedding. There was so much excitement about this young couple because Leopold and Charlotte walked arm in arm in the park. They seemed to be absolutely devoted to one another. And then there's a royal baby on the way. And this is the first time the bookies start taking bets on whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. There's a lot of royal wedding precedents and royal baby precedents that come out of Charlotte and Leopold's marriage and the conception of their child. There weren't bets on the name. If it was a boy, he was going to be George, like George the First, second, third, and fourth. So certainly there weren't baby name bets, but there were bets on how much the economy would expand if it was a baby boy versus a baby girl. And it's very sad. Charlotte was a victim of early 19th century medicine. She was put on a low iron, lowering diet that was supposed to reduce the size of the child, and it left her dangerously anemic. So she goes into labor in 1817, and it came to light. Remember, the tabloid press has just been invented around this time and sort of looked for a scapegoat, that the newly invented forceps had been in the room and the obstetrician had been afraid to use them. What if the heir was born with a broken nose, for example? So Charlotte
Terrible.
labored for 3 days. She gives birth to a stillborn baby boy. And then she bleeds to death and hemorrhages soon afterwards. And foreign diplomats noted that it was as though the whole country had lost their favorite child. People were hugging in the streets, they were hanging up black crepe. More than one historian has said Britain in 1817 wouldn't be like this again until 1997 with the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. It was very sad. The obstetrician ended up taking his own life as he was blamed for this. So it became known as the triple tragedy: the loss of the heiress to the throne, her stillborn son, the obstetrician as well. And of course, by this time, the future George the Fourth is the Prince Regent. He comes to the throne in 1820. He has lost his daughter and his stillborn grandchild, and he sees no reason to continue with this marriage. His wife had been living abroad
Yeah, well,
for
Caroline,
his.
this seems odd to pivot from the very sad to the slightly
Yes,
farcical, but Caroline,
yes,
as you say, has been traveling. She's
yes,
been sort of closely observed. Even though she was really popular, the
yes,
kind of scurrilous pamphleteers of the time, this
yes.
happened to a lot of women at this time,
Mhm.
in public life, made up, or did they make up, all kinds of stories about her supposedly loose morals, all the flings and affairs she's meant to be having with common born men. And so she has this
Yes.
reputation as a kind of fallen woman. Is that fair?
Well, this is complicated. Part of this, Caroline brings on herself in that she had this very unaffected manner. She could speak to people of all walks of life. She didn't have the hauteur that was expected of a princess of Wales. And so that left her very vulnerable to accusations about her character. And she seems to have found these accusations quite amusing. She fostered a number of poor children at various times, and of course, this led to rumors that turned out to be unfounded that these were children she'd given birth to out of wedlock. So she wasn't somebody who paid a lot of attention to her own reputation. She'd been forced into this
She
unhappy
sounds like an
marriage.
admirable woman. I mean, she was,
Yeah, that
as you
she
say,
was just
very
going to
popular
live
with the
life,
people.
yeah, on her own terms. And she made no secret of how unhappy her marriage was. Apparently, this is a wonderful detail that, that came up in the chapter on Queen Caroline in the collection that I co-edited on Hanoverian to Windsor consorts, because Katie Carpenter speaks about Caroline creating a kind of voodoo doll shaped as her husband and sticking pins in it. So Caroline was not afraid for the whole world to know her marriage was unhappy. She was going to live life as she chose. And this became a political issue, as so many Hanoverian family conflicts became at this time. That we see Hanoverian monarchs became at the center of the government, and then their heirs at the center of the official opposition. And we see those kinds of party politics developing around Hanoverian fathers and sons not getting along at all. And this was the case for Queen Caroline, that her cause gets taken up by radical politicians when George IV finally comes to the throne after many years of
All right,
George
so
III's
1820 are we at now?
pageantry.
I think 1820.
1820, 1820, and in 1821,
And
around,
he's the old guard. She's the people's
yes,
princess. She's
yes.
with the people. Things need to change. We've seen this dynamic many times
Oh,
since.
yes. And the
Um,
tabloid
and
press getting involved. There's a lot there.
and
And the
Gilray is painting all his pictures and all this
yeah,
happening. Has
and
Gilray finished? I'm maybe getting my historical
yeah, it's interesting with
satirists.
the Hanovers that political cartooning takes off to such a degree of that time. We see a lot of satirical cartoons about George III as Farmer George out in Kew Gardens and his wife, Queen Charlotte, as this careful housewife. Now that might be seen admirable, but at the time that was seen as not showing the dignity of a king and queen. And then in contrast, it's just after the Napoleonic Wars, there's an economic depression, and George IV is seen as ridiculously extravagant and out of touch with the conditions of the time. And so he introduces the Pains and Penalties Bill. It was a sort of bill put before the House of Lords, as back then you needed an act of parliament to get divorced. And so he wants his marriage ended so he can hopefully remarry. He was sort of casting eyes at Princess Feodora, who was the half sister of his niece, the future Queen Victoria, much
Such a
younger than
healthy situation, all
him.
of it,
Yeah,
isn't it?
gross. So, this obese older George IV, he wants to remarry. He wants to have another heir, and he introduces this Pains and Penalties Bill that basically is accusing Caroline of adultery abroad
So
with
this is
some
like a
very
public trial of her character.
Yes. This is a big public trial, and William Cobbett's just started publishing the Register, one of the earliest tabloid newspapers. And there's political cartoons at the time that show William Cobbett printing a big broadsheet that says "the Queen forever," as if he's found his cause and that a people's princess is being wronged. There were women who started wearing these ostrich feather headdresses that were brought into fashion by Queen Caroline to show their support for the Queens. This trial becomes a complete fiasco that undermines the monarchy
And
at
what
that
evidence are they
time.
bringing to this trial that she's been having affairs? Is it anything?
Basically, a lot of hearsay. There, we see evidence being brought in that, for instance, some of those children who she fostered, they weren't being allowed to sleep in her room anymore. And maybe that meant she was doing something scandalous, or that she was speaking with servants, while she was bathing, or otherwise not being properly attired when speaking to people further down the social scale. I mean, she may well have had
She
affairs.
sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Yes, certainly George the Fourth had affairs. There were accusations going back and forth, and her legal counsel was threatening to reveal every unpleasant thing about him that wasn't already known. So this became a huge issue, and like many of the most memorable royal scandals, it's about more than the two unhappy people involved. At the time, we see the emergence of more and more people are engaging with political life. These newly invented tabloid newspapers, they're more affordable because how they're printed, they're not subjected to the Stamp Act. And so literate working class people might be able to access this information and get a kind of play by play of what's happening at court to a degree to which hadn't been the case previously. Certainly, there'd been a lot of interest in Henry VIII's divorces, but that tended to play out in court circles, people who saw the king on progresses with a new queen. News did spread, but it certainly didn't spread the way it did in George the Fourth's time. And this becomes about more than George the Fourth and Queen Caroline, that what happens is that women are encouraged by the tabloid press, by William Cobbett publishing the Register, to write to their members of parliament, because if the king may put aside his wife, it'll be open season. Any man might put aside his wife. There'll be all these abandoned wives and children. Society's going to collapse. The whole institution of marriage is going to be undermined. And it's interesting to see this awareness in 1820, in the early 19th century, that what members of the royal family did could trickle down to a wide degree to people further down the social scale. So just as we think of today royal fashions or royal baby names being picked up in a big way, or whether William or Harry decide to take a paternity leave is seen as influencing other fathers, there were big concerns in 1820, and this is expressed. Some of the big writers at the time, that Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, thought the Pains and Penalties Bill sounded terrible. It sounded like she was being tortured, or and there was a lot of sympathy. Jane Austen, although George the Fourth was a great admirer of her books and insisted that Emma be dedicated to him, and her publisher sort of made her go along with that, Austen was appalled by how he treated his wife. And
I
so
never
we get
knew
this
that.
rich.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's so
So what
interesting.
happened? Does this trial actually conclude?
The
Is there a
trial
verdict?
concludes by George the Fourth deciding to withdraw the whole thing because it's becoming such a cause célèbre of the day. It's perhaps the first instance of a monarch deciding public opinion is swaying in this
That is so
way, that
interesting.
that it's best to just step back. And he would have been prepared to just pay her to stay abroad, but she wanted to come back and be queen. So
Now, this
coronation.
I'm just going to interrupt you because this sets the
Oh,
scene for one of the greatest and most scandalous moments in British history. So
yes.
I'm going to leave you the floor to sort of paint the picture.
Yes, it's interesting. When King Charles III was crowned last year, I was asked, well, what are things that have gone wrong at coronations over the years? And I'm like, well,
Where do
um,
I start?
yeah, where do I start? Because it's very much Queen Victoria's time with photography and film that we see royal ceremonies being rehearsed and carefully choreographed for the public. Before that, a lot of things could go wrong for George III and Queen Charlotte. There was always the threat that these canopies being held over them might collapse at any time. That it was clear that there hadn't been a lot of rehearsal. But it gets worse for George IV, that he decides his queen is not going to be admitted to the coronation. And the problem that ensues is she shows up anyway. Nobody stops Queen Caroline. She had come back wanting to be queen, and now she wants to be crowned and tries to gain admittance. There were accounts that George IV had, hired some, street prize fighters in order to guard Westminster Abbey so she wouldn't be able to get in. And sympathetic attendees tried to slip her their own tickets because, anyone without a ticket couldn't be admitted. But the guards had strict instructions. The queen was not to be admitted.
So she literally turns up at the door and he said,
she turns
"You're
up at
not
the
on the
door.
list.
You're not on the list. No, you can't have someone else's invitation. You're not getting in." And so she tries to gain admittance, and we see now the crowd's opinions have shifted. By this point, she's taken a cash settlement at the end of this trial, and so that's alienated some of these radical politicians who wanted her to keep pushing back against George IV. She wanted to live comfortably and takes a settlement. So public opinion had shifted, and the sight of her, basically banging on the door of Westminster Abbey, trying to be admitted to be crowned as queen consort, that led to a lot of jeering, people making comments about, go back to your, lover in Italy. And so we see Caroline had gotten a lot of sympathy at one point, but this scene at the coronation tips the scales. Of course, George
It's so
IV,
typical of the British people, all the radical talk you like. And when it comes to it, we just doff the cap, to authority.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true.
George IV doesn't come out very well in all this either, because he was fascinated by the past and insisted there be all these Tudor and Stuart costumes ordered by members of the royal court to attend his coronation. The expenses were astronomical. He throws a big coronation banquet that descends into chaos, as there were those invited to the banquet at Westminster Hall, and then those who were sort of invited to watch, standing up in the galleries, who came down and raided the leftovers after the king and the more prominent guests had departed, and of course making off with the silverware as souvenirs. So this was enormously expensive. And so we see why in 1830, when George IV finally passes away and his younger brother, William IV, comes to the throne, William IV wondered if he even needed to have a coronation, because it had been such a fiasco for his elder brother. So Queen Caroline did not long survive the embarrassment of the coronation. She had a bowel obstruction, and she passed away. And it's interesting, there's a possibly apocryphal story that when Napoleon passed away, the Duke of Wellington went to George IV and said, "Sire, your greatest enemy is dead," and that he'd reacted, "Is she, by God?" thinking this was about Queen Caroline when it was about Napoleon.
Well, you've completely. I've got my little list of questions here. We've covered about a tenth of it. We're never going to do this in one program. You're going to have to come back. This is amazing. I'm really enjoying this. So in 10, 15 minutes remaining, maybe we could talk a little bit about Albert. We've done a woman, let's do a man. And I guess their wedding night was perhaps the polar opposite of the one we just described.
Like her cousin Princess Charlotte, grows up as the hope of the monarchy, because after Charlotte died, suddenly her middle-aged uncles, the younger brothers of George IV, are being prevailed upon to put aside their mistresses, marry princesses of childbearing age. First one to father an heir gets some debts paid, but a legitimate heir was needed, because Charlotte had been the only legitimate grandchild of George III. George III had 15 children, but it was assumed as long as there was Charlotte's uncles could do as they wished. They didn't have to marry suitable princesses. So there was a double wedding in 1818, in which the future William IV married Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and that they didn't have any children, the two of them. William IV had 10 children previously with an actress named Dorothy Jordan, but he doesn't have any surviving children with Adelaide. They have two daughters who pass away in infancy. And then the next son. So we have George IV, Frederick, Duke of York, who predeceases his brother. We have William IV, the Duke of Clarence, and then we have the fourth son, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent and Strathearn, who's quite well known here in Canada because Prince Edward Island is named after him.
So,
He
so I'm,
lived
I'm
in
just thinking, I bet you're really good at pub quizzes.
Yes, I really enjoy
I
all of
should
the
also
little.
say to you, actually, just to interrupt the flow of information, which I'm loving, I'm sitting about 400 yards from the River Thames, and all of these women that you've mentioned, Dorothy Jordan and lots of the other Georgian mistresses and their families, the beautiful houses along the river, that's kind of where they all used to hang out.
Yes, and sometimes with the Duke of Kent, there's questions about his time in Canada in the 1790s. He becomes commander in chief of the British North American forces, and he lived in Quebec City, he lived in Halifax with his French mistress, Julie Saint Laurent. And there's a lot of Canadians who wonder, did he have any children here?
Uh-huh.
And are there descendants of half siblings of Queen Victoria who live here? But I don't think that was the case simply because the Georgians, if they had illegitimate children, they tended to be loud and proud about that. They didn't tend to have the secret children. William IV quite proudly acknowledged all of the Fitzjordans. So I think if there were Canadian Kent children, I think they would have been
Well,
acknowledged.
maybe he was
So
just
the
doing his bit for Anglo-French relations in Canada, which haven't always been easy, let's be honest.
Well, he brought Julie Saint Laurent with him from France. She wasn't
She
French
wasn't a French
Canadian.
Canadian. Oh, he wouldn't go that far then.
Yeah. So, so the Duke of Kent returned. He had a 29-year relationship with Julie Saint Laurent, but with the death of Charlotte, he then marries a widow, Victoire of Saxe-Leiningen, and she had two children, so he knew she was fertile. Theodora, who'd attracted attention from an elderly George IV, and Charles, who would become the next Duke of Saxe-Leiningen. And so the Duke of Kent and Victoire are married in this double wedding with William and Adelaide, and they have a baby girl, Alexandrina, named for Tsar Alexander I, her godfather, and then Victoria, named for her mother, George IV, who was quite embittered. His brother had a healthy baby girl when he lost his own daughter, refused for there to be royal names like Charlotte or Georgiana or Elizabeth to be used for this baby girl. So Victoria hadn't been a common name in England at that time. And so it becomes associated with this new royal baby. And sadly, when she's just 9 months old, her father, the Duke of Kent, passes away of pneumonia. And she's raised by her mother and her mother's shady financial advisor, John Conroy, at Kensington Palace, away from the rest of
We've
the
all
House of
seen the film.
Hanover.
We've all
Yeah,
seen the film.
well, the film tends to overemphasize Victoria being isolated, that her mother actually did take her on tours around Britain. She wanted the future queen to be seen by the public. So I find the films emphasize the Kensington system, that she could never be alone. She slept in her mother's room. She was being walked up and down the stairs with the help of a servant all the way until she was 18. The films jump on that and the amount of bullying that she received from John Conroy, who wanted to make sure he was looked after in the next reign. But she in fact did travel. She saw some of the coal mines, at least from a distance, some of the factories of Birmingham. She was well aware the Industrial Revolution was underway. And I find sometimes the ITV series makes it seem as though Prince Albert had to explain to her that the world was changing. And Victoria would have known that the world was changing at that time. So she was more prepared than we think. But what was different from her predecessors is she's raised away from her Hanoverian relatives. So we get a cultural divide from sort of Hanover, the sort of the gambling, the mistresses, the environment of the Georgian era, to the respectability of the Victorian era. Victoria was determined when she comes to the throne, she succeeds William IV in 1837. She's determined to make the monarchy respectable again. And her marriage to Prince Albert, she
And was she
presents
very
herself.
conscious that she wanted a different kind of marriage? Because as you said, there's just a history of kind of bad relationships or negotiated relationships
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
just kind of general nastiness.
yes, it's interesting. One of her mentors was actually Charlotte's widower, Leopold, who had landed on his feet and had become king of the
Oh, that's
Belgians.
interesting.
And he very much romanticized that time he'd had with Charlotte before she died in childbirth, that his subsequent wife could not quite live up to the memory of the lost Charlotte who had adored him. And so certainly Victoria would have heard of that, and she would have wanted that kind of idealized relationship. Now, maybe if Leopold and Charlotte had been married for longer, perhaps it wouldn't have been in the honeymoon period the whole time. But Victoria would have been hearing about that. Also, her parents, they had been married a very short time, and it seems to have been happy the time that they were together. So Victoria would have heard of some of these idealized marriages, and she was determined to marry for love. And and there was a very narrow pool of people who Victoria could marry. She couldn't marry a commoner. She was the reigning queen, but she also couldn't marry someone who was first in line for another throne. So the very dashing future Tsar Alexander II came to visit very early in her reign, and they danced till 5 a.m. She was delighted. Some of these ballroom dances that she needed someone of her own rank to dance with, that they were dancing the mazurka till all hours, going to the opera, having a wonderful time because they could socialize as people of the same rank. They were around the same age, but he was certainly not a possibility. Their grandchildren would marry. His grandson's the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Her granddaughter is Alexandra of Hesse-Darmstadt. So certainly Alexander II and Queen Victoria's descendants would marry one another, but they could not marry each other. Alexander and Victoria could not. So Victoria had to find a younger son of a royal house. And when she first met Prince Albert, she wasn't as impressed with him because she liked to dance all night. He liked to be in bed by 9. And there was a contrast. She was much more sociable. He was more fastidious in terms of who he was willing to associate with. But then she meets him a second time and is overawed not just by how handsome he was, but how cultured. They would play duets on the piano. They would discuss German literature. And she had to propose to him as she was the reigning queen,
What
and he had
language
been.
were they talking in?
They would have been speaking German, as certainly her mother was German. Her governess, Baroness Lesen, who would have a bit of a power struggle with Prince Albert over who was most influential over Victoria, who's German as well. And and so it's interesting to see that they came to this accord and they married and they presented themselves as this ideal married couple. In Victoria's portrait, she's surrounded by children as well as wearing the Order of the Garter. So you get, say, the Winterhalter painting that's on the cover of my book, Raising Royalty: 1,000 Years of Royal Parenting, that depicts Victoria the Queen, but also Victoria the wife and mother. However, behind the scenes, there were power struggles. Albert was never content to be just a consort. He wanted more and more influence and power of his own, and to act as a kind of co-monarch. And Victoria gave birth to 9 children in a 16-year period, and she found childbearing to be exhausting, frightening. Of course, there was what had happened to her cousin, Princess Charlotte, without whose death Victoria probably never would have been born. Her parents might not have married. And so Victoria had these difficult pregnancies. She may have suffered from postpartum depression after some of these pregnancies. So Albert becomes more and more influential. So there's their personal bond, but also this political union that they very much reign together. And when he dies in 1861 of either typhoid fever or Helen Rappaport suggested he may have had Crohn's disease and complications from that, that once Prince Albert dies, Victoria had to relearn how to function as a monarch herself because she was used to being part of a married couple. So Victoria spends the last 40 years of her reign as the widow of Windsor. And it's very different from Queen Elizabeth II. who passed away just over a year after Prince Philip. And the public was used to seeing Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip together to the degree to which, after he retired from public life, there were comments about does the Queen look lonely, or the Diamond Jubilee when Prince Philip had to go into hospital with a bladder infection after that very rainy Thames
Yep,
Jubilee
just
River
down there,
pageant.
just over there.
Yeah, yeah, that it wasn't very good weather that day, and he had to
Horrible.
go
I
into
remember it. It was
hospital.
horrible.
So there were comments with the Queen looks very lonely. So when we think about Queen Elizabeth II's legacy, we think of Queen Elizabeth II beginning speeches, my husband and I, and being part of this enduring partnership for decades. Whereas Queen Victoria has that very brief early period of her reign where she is a young woman who was eager to be part of court life for the first time, as she hadn't even been allowed to attend the coronation of her predecessor, William IV, which had made her cry. She had wanted to be part of that ceremony. And then she has those 20 years or so as a married woman, the mother of 9 children, and then 40 years as the widow of Windsor, where she has a reputation as the mother of the British Empire, the grandmother of Europe, and is seen as Victoria alone. And if Albert hadn't died at such a young age in his 40s, we likely would have seen a different court culture, a different Victorian era, as we would be seeing more of his initiatives later in the 19th century. Victoria always claimed to be acting in his interest, but as the decades passed, it was clear that she had her own interests. We don't know if Albert would have been in favor, for instance, of Victoria becoming Empress of India, for example, that she was much more personally involved in the British Empire. And Prince Albert, as is discussed in Hanoverian to Windsor Consorts, he was very interested in India and the empire, and had the controversial Kohinoor diamond faceted for the Great Exhibition. But whether he would have favored Victoria being in that role as Empress and there being this much bigger royal presence in the wider British Empire and dominions, that's a matter of debate. So it's one of the big what ifs of history, how Victoria's reign might have
Well,
unfolded.
I'm determined to have you back because we've barely scratched the surface of your knowledge, I suspect, and it's just fascinating material. Just final question though, we're talking about Victoria and Albert. Can you think of another royal consort that was as successful as him?
And well, Prince Albert early in the marriage isn't quite as successful. He was seen as a bit of a fortune hunter, this comparatively poor prince who was making a very wealthy marriage. And there's satirical imagery showing him surrounded by all of these children and being in some ways more focused on home and family while his wife governed and reigned. So and met with her prime ministers as a constitutional monarch. So Albert, early in his time in England, wasn't necessarily all that well received. It
Right.
takes him time to grow into the role, to be comfortable around the English court and the English people, and for there to be success for his big initiatives like the Great Exhibition. There was a lot of skepticism about whether that would be a success. And when the Great Exhibition is successful and really raises the profile of Britain and British manufacturing and culture and kickstarts the travel industry in many ways, then we see Albert getting a lot of respect. One of his last acts was to keep Britain out of the American Civil War when tensions, were quite high at that time. So Albert has been remembered for many of his initiatives and his political acumen today, but in his own time, it took him some time to grow into the role. And I think that's important when we look at any royal consort, that often when the marriage first happens, there's the question about how are they going to adjust to their new role? What kinds of expectations are they bringing to this role? And then often they will emerge from this process as a respected elder statesman or stateswoman. So we see that with some of the more recent royal consorts as well, that Prince Philip, certainly when he married Princess Elizabeth, he had all these ideas about modernizing the monarchy that didn't necessarily go over very well among some of the courtiers and staff who surrounded George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. And Queen Elizabeth II had a lot of respect for her father's generation. So it took some time for cautious reforms to be introduced. And certainly with the current Queen Camilla, there's been an absolute transformation in terms of the press coverage she received when she first came to public notice and how she is viewed today after decades of a successful marriage to King Charles III, her charity work, her various initiatives on behalf of domestic violence survivors, for instance. So we see that often a new royal consort, there is this period where they're very intensely scrutinized, and some come through that and become respected elder statesmen and stateswomen. And then some sadly have the experience of Queen Caroline, where they are just never able to establish themselves in that new role. So there's a
Well,
very
I wouldn't have
long and interesting
liked to be the
history.
person telling Camilla she couldn't come into the Abbey. I think that would have been quite scary. You got
Oh,
a horsewhip out.
that would never have happened as King Charles III and Queen Camilla have this very close
They do.
relationship,
No,
and
you're
it's
absolutely right. I mean, it's good to
very
hear that from the
clear
Canadian perspective as well, actually,
yeah.
that as we've seen in Britain, you know, her image has completely transformed from the
It's
days
complete.
of the War of the Walesers that we all remember. I'm going to have to stop this because I'm running out of time, but I could talk to you. I'm going to, if you let me, talk to you again very soon. And
I'm happy to come back.
we didn't even get to Marie Antoinette.
Oh, yes, we should have a whole other episode on Marie Antoinette. I'd be happy to have an episode about Henrietta Maria as well. And we should talk about the Romanovs
Oh my
sometime.
God, I'm thinking of a whole
There's a
new
lot to say
series of
there.
podcasts. You probably have your own.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for joining me. Your morning, my afternoon. All the very best.
Lovely chatting with you. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks again. Bye.
Bye now.
Well, Reginald Grunt Futtock, if that's your real name, I bet it isn't. Anyway, I think you missed a real treat. And I hope those of us who enjoyed Carolyn will forgive Reginald if he decides to return. Or maybe I just need to stop hectoring and sneering. Oh, you can see it hurt. Anyway, I don't mind any criticism today because today is a good day. It is Proofmas. Happy Proofmas to Phil. Merry Proofmas. Yep, I am writing a book. I may mention it a couple of dozen times. I've been writing this book, well, researching it and writing it for over 2 years. And today I got the proofs. So even though I'm on holiday, I couldn't stop looking at the proofs. As you probably know, or where you first see the book as it's properly laid out, and it's a chance to make all kind of final corrections. But it looks lovely. I'm really excited, although obviously obsessively interested in very tiny aspects of pronunciation. And, is that justified to the left or should that be justified to? Should that indented or not? Anyway, hours of fun ahead for Phil, but the book's on schedule. I'm also dealing with the illustrations, which is definitely the most irritating part. If you think getting interviews is complicated, you try getting permission to use photographs. Oh my God. And everybody who owns photographs seems to think that authors have got tons of money. Well, we haven't. But still, it's fun. That little finessing of the last moments of book are, it's like when you make a TV show. Those last few moments when you're mixing the sound is where the real fun is. So, yeah, happy Proofmas to me. And what's to say about coming up? Oh, no, Laura's back. Laura Thompson, I think it might be her fourth appearance on the pod. She's going back to talk about her wonderful book, Heiresses, which is a scandal-rich account of the pleasures and pitfalls of being an heiress. In history and in literature, there's some really quite scary true life stories about women who, they seem to have it all, but often because they have it all, they're targeted and sometimes it's taken away from them. And sometimes they fight back and have amazing lives. So it's full of great human drama. And that'll be next week's show. And lots of other things bubbling. I can't decide whether to do a Christmas special this year or who should be on it. But I will let you know next week. And thank you for watching. Really appreciate your company. Do please keep liking and subscribing. Subscriptions have crept up a bit. I'm over, I think I'm now 9.8 thousand, so only 200 short of 10,000. So if you know anybody who would love our podcast, who would like to join us here, or if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please pop over to YouTube and subscribe. It's free, and you won't get, you can click a notification button so you don't get spammed with lots of emails, and it would help me. So like, subscribe, and thanks again for your company. I will see you next week when I'm back in rainy London. But for now, from lovely sunny Madeira, here we go. There we go. One last look. Aren't I lucky? From me, from Mrs. Craig, from naughty Jennifer, the mother-in-law. Bye-bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.